I take a look at, for instance, Kevin Flynn, who's a transportation reporter for the Rocky Mountain News, has now opened up his own news site on transportation-related issues. In Jefferson County, there's a site that's just for Jefferson County news. And we're seeing all these tiny little sites, but my sense is they're still pretty small in who reads them. But I see the trajectory just going skyrocketing.
Well, and this is one of the reasons why I think aggregators, whether it's mine or some other style like that, and it's not simply just enough to subscribe to someone's RSS feed, and I think after a while even that gets a little, it gets to be like an email inbox where you have 500 emails and you just don't get around to reading all of them. But having some sort of aggregator that knows where each of these niche news producers is, checks in on them daily, or is actually in communication with them in advance, so that if Alan does have a scoop, then you know that it's coming down the pike and you're prepared to give it maximum exposure when it does happen, so that there's not a great lag there.
But there's also, how to put this politely, for any of those in the Denver Post, don't take this as a bad thing, there's just not the same amount of investigative reporting as there was back in the day. You know, right now reporters are stretched to the limit. They've got to follow a lot of different beats. There used to be, you know, one guy on sports, one guy on transportation, one guy for the city, a few guys for the state, and they knew that area. Now it seems as though a press release comes in and whoever it catches, catch can, and they're being stretched out. And that's why sites like Complete Colorado or Ed News Colorado really can break a story, and if they're good, they should be picked up by the Denver Post and Channel 9 News and 850 KOA and the rest. Often they're not. Why?
Well, we do have a partnership with 9 News, so that's going to start to happen more and more with us, and we're forging other partnerships because they need, you know, the TV stations too. They need the content. They're desperate for it. They've had cutbacks as well, and so I think that kind of stuff will start to happen. But you know, by hiring Nancy Mitchell, who is a great investigative reporter, and all she has to do is worry about covering education in Colorado, and she can just focus on that. And if it takes her 3 weeks to do a story, that's fine. We've got other, you know, ways to fill the website, and we just can dedicate those kind of resources. And I think that's really important, that kind of stuff continues to happen.
I think those kinds of news partnerships absolutely they're destined to grow in the next decade. As for why do some investigative reports why do we see a decrease in investigative reporting? As you know, John, I mean, first of all, investigative reporting is an expensive enterprise. You sometimes spend a lot of time and effort running down the wrong rabbit hole into something that doesn't produce into any copy or into a story. So that's one reason. The other reason is when you look at the resources, the overall resources that newspapers used to have, and as they've shrunk, you know, an investigative reporter told me a long time ago, and I agree with this, that the best investigative reports really don't come from an investigative reporter. They come from somebody that's actually on the city hall beat or the police beat or something like that, and they build up those small networks of trust, and then when they're on a regular day-to-day story, someone goes, by the way, did you hear? And
give me an example. What's a good example?
I'm just thinking of a good example, and I'm not thinking of one that happened to me, but you know, let's say you're on a cop beat, and every day you go down to the police department and you start to build up a relationship with those cops, and then one of the cops says, by the way, did you hear that Jerry Whitman actually took a month off to, what was the story that didn't the Rocky have about Jerry Whitman had taken some time off for to lose some weight or for his back problems, and
I think it was a sex change operation.
Yeah, but won't touch on that. But so, anyways, those gems usually come just because you're there every single day. And when you look at, again, going back to the resources that newspapers used to have, first of all, having all of the beat reporters, which
in other words, it was relationships, and that when you had beat reporters, they built up relationships with whatever entity they were following, which could be good or could be bad, but you know, tips would fall their way. Which is, if there was an education story, you go to Mitchell because she knows the story.
But I think there's another real development over the last 10 or 15 years since I left daily newspaper journalism that's really important, and it's a different kind of investigative journalism. And this is something that people like Nancy are expert at, and that's computer-assisted reporting, which is, even if you don't have a source, if you just know how to analyze databases, if you know how to file Open Records Act requests, if you know how to then build your own databases to run analyses of stuff, like you can find stories. Well, Nancy did a story for us a couple of months ago about how something like 99% of all teachers in Colorado receive positive evaluations, despite the fact we know that not 99% of teachers are good. But there are reasons for that, such as it's so hard to get rid of a teacher that if you go down the road of giving someone an unsatisfactory satisfactory evaluation, then you have to start proceedings against them. And most principals just say, you know, I've got to run a school. It's too much of a headache to go down that road. But she, you know, she did that by going and getting all the information and digging it out. And there was a national report that was done just after her story that used Denver as one example, but then looked at cities around the country. But she analyzed all the local school districts and found, you know, that actually DPS, because it only rated 97% of their teachers as, you know, acceptable, was by far the toughest on their teachers, because most districts were 99% or higher. So, you know, that kind of story that you can use data that's existing out there, if you know how to dig it up and you know how to analyze it, that's a different kind of investigative
Which really
journalism.
turns, you know, the difference between a reporter, a good investigative reporter, and a policy analyst starts to get blurred. I mean, a good reporter has an eye for a sexy story, one that's going to click quickly, but something like you just described is something that's important, people ought to know, but it's not Watergate. You didn't catch anybody on tape doing something they should have. It was analysis that a good policy wonk would do.
Well, occasionally, sometimes those analyses do yield this sort of sexy, eye-popping stories. I mean, I'm familiar with an investigation that happened out near the Washington, D.C. area, where they did an analysis of police overtime, and then they were able to link that back to a couple of cops that had had too much overtime through a certain period, were closely linked to a couple of fatal incidents. So what seemed to be sort of the just data, the incomprehensible numbers, did eventually lead to a sexier story or a more sort of eye-catching story in terms of, you know, how do we monitor our public safety, the people that work in our public safety, how do we monitor their overtime and whether or not they're working themselves to death? And just to one other note about data reporting or computer-assisted reporting, this is why I've been saying for a while, I think the most important thing that investigative reporters need in the upcoming years are actuaries and accountants, people that can take this data and really do the analysis, because, I mean, I've got a little bit of a math ground, but I'm still not an actuary.
What is the resistance, though, when you have a good story? Now, that seems like a huge story to me.
Yeah.
That should be a front-page Denver Post story that, you know, 99% of all teachers are getting good reviews. That can't be true. What keeps that story from then being picked up by the Denver Post and say, listen, because you might have 1,000 people reading that story, I'll guarantee you it gets passed around by people in the education business, but there are a lot of parents out there who would benefit from that story. I didn't hear that story until you just told it to me.
Channel 9 actually picked it up and did a little thing on it, but it was one of their newscasts, you know, at 5 o'clock, and it was a very brief piece, and so it didn't go any farther than that. I think it's, you know, the old, if a tree falls in the forest and only 800 people hear it, does it make any noise, as opposed to 400,000 people hearing it? And I think that there really is a sense, I mean, I know this from having been inside the newspapers, that if you really get beat on a story that's an enterprise story, that isn't just you forgot to go to a press conference or something, it's easier to ignore it than to have to eat that crow and go and then follow somebody else's exclusive.
But why is it eating crow? Why can't the Denver Post just say, Ed News Colorado reports this? I mean, that's still news, and is a turf, you know, because I don't think the turf war between the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News would be the same between the Denver Post and your small news site.
No, you wouldn't think so. And, you know, we get along great with the education writer there. He's a friend, and we talk to him all the time. But I think there is a sense among some of the editors who are aware of our existence that anybody out there who's trying to do news is a little bit of a competitor.
Well, in Complete Colorado has broken some stories. You mentioned at the top the story about the National Senatorial Committee looking like they endorsed Jane Norton by taking these domain names and putting it aside. By getting that out front, the other papers had to cover that. It became a good piece.